Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Well, hello, it's Zoe and welcome to the show. Lots of exciting things happening in the world. Here is a good piece of news from Planet Human. Upside Foods cultivated chicken has been approved for sale in the United States. What does this mean? It means that you can eat chicken without having to kill a chicken. And there's a lot of futurists excited by this because it could mean the transformation of animal production into the future, one where you don't actually have to manage a live being. You just can manage its cultivated cells. Yes, and is what I'd hear my futurist friends saying, is what are the resources required to produce such a thing? Is it scalable? Is it resource intensive or resource friendly? So much to be answered. And what I know from the research into this space of the future of food is we'll probably continue to have live chickens grown and cultivated and harvested in the traditional way, whether that's mass manufacturing and mass farm or backyard chickens, so i.e. from a live animal. And we'll probably also have it supplemented with laboratory cultivated chicken meat as well. The question for you is, would you eat it? What does it mean? What could this mean? And will it have the same nutritional value? And are we missing something spiritual, says the vegetarian, and I mean this wholeheartedly, if we eat the flesh of an animal that wasn't cultivated from an animal? Because there is something sacred in consuming life that came from life. All right, I'll leave that for you to percolate on. On Planet Zoe, you know what? I'm just so grateful I can run again. After my knee injury last year, I was off running for 5 months and it took 6 months to really come back into form. And I've just really been enjoying being able to move my body. So just an expression of gratitude for being fit and healthy and being able to move. I quite enjoy running and just being outside amongst the elements and something very primal and natural about it. Not that I'm built for running by any way, shape, or form. I like to say, I'm built like a belly dancer, not a runner. And yet it brings me so much joy. So my question for you today is, what could go wrong and how bad could it get? And are you ready? So rather a serious tone to the start to the episode, but this is what we need to address. And my guest today is Tom Fox. He is a compliance expert and he has an enormous amount of podcasts under his banner to do with compliance in different iterations and different focuses. So we talk a lot about what could go wrong and how we can troubleshoot some of these issues and some of the things that we need to contend with and how much money it's costing us. We also talk about Russia and Ukraine and the conflict with China and how this all impacts on us as leaders. So a very big picture, important conversation. So without further ado, here is Tom Fox. Well, all the way from West Texas, welcome to the show, Tom Fox.
Thanks, Zoe. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today.
That's great because I have lots of big picture questions for you on things like compliance and international affairs and how it affects leadership and business today. So, lots of cool stuff to dig into. So let's start with, how did you get into this line of work and, as you call yourself, the Compliance Evangelist?
So my last corporate position, I was general counsel at a company that had violated the U.S. international anti-corruption law called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This was 2007. At that time, you didn't remediate or fix the problem until after you had been assigned your penalty. Now that's changed where you fix it during your investigation. So back then, I was part of a new management team that they threw out the old guys who engaged in the bribery and corruption, and I was part of the new team that was brought in to resolve the problem. That was really the first time I learned about that particular law and building compliance programs so that corporations would follow that law.
So getting into preventative measures and instead of trying to clean up a mess after they've broken the law.
Right.
Okay. What was that like, defending a big company against a criminal investigation? Was there a lot of pressure?
No, because I didn't do any of that. I came in after all of that was resolved.
Okay.
So the fine and penalty had been assigned by the time I got there. I mean, I knew that was coming, but I was strictly brought in to be a part of the team that built out a compliance program for the company that was effective.
Okay. So to keep companies from doing the wrong thing in the future.
Right.
And is it a case, I'm just curious because I don't know anything about this field of work. Is it the case that some companies just don't know what the law is? Or is it that they deliberately try and get around it?
So it's not the former. Everybody knows what the law is. And if you don't, well, shame on you. But it's usually a combination of what you suggested and a couple of other things. One is the over-reliance on financial incentives, which put pressure on people to cut corners and engage in bribery and corruption, and then not having appropriate oversight mechanisms in place, internal controls, policies and procedures, et cetera, which would detect any nefarious conduct.
So I thank you for raising those points, because one of the big ones I see in a lot of organizations is their remuneration system. Their KPIs can drive some of this underhanded, cutting corners, even criminal behavior. And in fact, here right now in Australia, there's a big case going on against PwC, one of the major global multinationals, who have been, they suspect or proven to have given away secrets of the Australian government to their big corporate clients about how they can get around the corporation taxes. So how can they save their corporate clients tax money by getting this inside information that they got as clients to the government? So yeah, big problem. So that's sort of on the boil right now as we go to recording this, is what's going to happen to PwC for doing these underhanded things because of the incentives of servicing big clients, etc. So as a compliance evangelist, do you dig into that at all with your clients about being mindful of how your remuneration and your KPIs may affect this? Is that part of your remit?
The only thing I would change in your question is it's not may, it's does. So if you financially incentivize people to sell, or else they will sell. And the best example I can give you is I once worked for a company where the then country manager in a country in your part of the world, Asia Pacific, said the following: if I violate the code of conduct, I may or may not get caught. If I violate the code of conduct and am caught, I may or may not be disciplined. If I miss my numbers for 2 quarters, I'll be fired. Well, if that's the incentives in your company, and that was a disincentive, everyone gets the message. Don't miss your numbers for 2 quarters. And he's now APAC regional manager for that company. You know, he never missed his numbers. So you have to make it clear that it's not just hitting your numbers, it's hitting your numbers while doing business ethically and in compliance with the culture of the company, which is hopefully a culture of compliance. Other things are like 100% salary based on commission. If your salary is totally commission-based, you will sell because you have to sell to eat. If a large portion of your discretionary bonus is your personal commissions, once again, you are incentivized to cut corners and sell. So there's a variety of mixes on the financial side and financial incentives that you can put in place, still compensate people well. But you don't have to give them a straight commission-based salary or commission-based discretionary bonus.
Okay. So what I'm hearing in revamping or considering your KPIs and reward portfolio is that, yes, you can incentivize people, and with that, to have some boundaries around that and to have other mechanisms in place to prevent the underhanded behavior. So I'm just going to toss out one of the ones I've seen in different organizations is that their remuneration is not just based on numbers, it's also based on contribution to culture as evaluated by their peers. And that's one other mechanism. And they're penalized if they do anything that's underhanded, et cetera. Is that the kind of thing that you work with your clients around in terms of setting up incentives that have checks and balances in them?
Sure. So, for instance, an easy metric is, did you take compliance training? Did you pass the test or whatever mechanism you use to determine effectiveness of that training? That's one. It's a pretty simple one. And many years ago, that's what we used. But now it's a little more sophisticated. Do you participate in company events that really sponsor doing business ethically and in compliance? Do you do compliance minutes when you open company meetings? Are you a participant in communications within the company, whether it's a compliance moment, whether it's to help the compliance department create some compliance training or something else, which would demonstrate your commitment to doing business ethically and in compliance? And you can even expand that to, do you do things to help foster the culture your company wants to put forward? So if that sounds sort of soft and squishy, perhaps it is, but these are things that HR measures on a regular basis. And just because something is not a dollar metric doesn't mean you can't measure it and can't evaluate someone on it.
Oh, I agree that you can measure lots of different things that are important to you. I'm curious about this notion of compliance as an entire practice department in an organization, because I find that surprising. Why do we have a whole thing around people following the rules? Like, how do you actually, compliance training, what does that consist of? Does that consist of, these are the laws and this is how you need to fulfill them? These are your obligations? Can you just explain that a little bit to a complete newbie like me?
So there's lots of questions in what you just said. I want to start with the training. Disabuse yourself of the notion that you don't need to tell people to do the right thing. They'll do the right thing. No, they don't. They are incentivized to make money. So what you do have to give people is the parameters, the guardrails, their obligations of the expectations that you have of them. If your corporate expectation is we will do business ethically and in compliance, you really should communicate that to your people, and you should reinforce that message through ongoing communications. There are some specific rules around anti-bribery corruption policies and procedures. And for the gatekeepers who have to work in that area, perhaps targeted focus training would be appropriate. Or it's not would be, it is appropriate. But for the employee who's not in sales, who's in a corporate office function or support function, they may not need that targeted training. So the first thing to do is figure out or risk rank your employees for potential bribery and corruption. And by risk rank, I mean to engage in bribery and corruption, you have to pay a bribe. How are you going to fund that bribe? Typically, an employee does not have enough money in their own bank account to pay a bribe big enough to get a contract, which means they have to steal that money from somewhere, and they steal it from the company. So if I could contrast that with a fraudster who steals money from a company and keeps it, someone engaged in bribery and corruption would steal money from the company, but then use it to pay a bribe. So it could be expense reimbursement fraud. It could be marketing expense fraud. It could be charitable donation fraud. It could be manipulation of the contract price or discounts on the contract. It could be a wide variety of basically fraud techniques, but it's creating a pot of money to pay a bribe. So that's kind of the first analysis of your employees. Are they in a position that they could do that? If they're not, they probably don't need as focused a training, and a 1-year refresher on your code of conduct with ongoing communications is probably enough. For salespeople, for marketing people, for charitable donation folks, for accounts payable people who approve sales, they should get more focused, targeted training to what their role is in a compliance program, and then ongoing training in the form of microburst or a short video or something on an ongoing basis just to remind them. And it could be, if you are going back to Canada, you would get a video about don't pay a bribe going through customs, just as a reminder, something like that. So that would be targeted for you for one instance, just as a reminder, not to teach you. So use sort of a scale of communications. It's risk-based on what the employee's position is, and then you try to give them the training they need to accomplish whatever their task is, and then do it on an ongoing basis. Do not do a one-day 287-slide PowerPoint deck written by lawyers for lawyers. Talk to people in regular language and in ways that they're going to understand. So that's training. Culture is a little bit different because that's fostered across the organization. So talking about culture and talking about the way we do things in a company is also an ongoing dialogue and ongoing communication within an organization.
Yeah, I agree that culture is, both those things need different methodologies to approach them, whether it's the rule, follow the rules and be a good person versus, and that's how we do things around here. They're kind of integrated. And as you're talking, I'm like, how prevalent is this issue that companies and individuals within companies don't comply? Like, maybe I'm just very naive because I just find it gobsmacking that people would do this. But like I said, maybe I'm just naive and haven't seen the world enough. So how prevalent is this issue?
The United Nations estimates that over the past 3 years, $3 trillion annually is lost to the global economy through bribery and corruption. If you add on money laundering, it's another $2 trillion. So that's $5 trillion lost annually to the world's economy that could be used for whatever reason, social welfare, building bridges, building roads, doing infrastructure, that's lost because it's lining the pockets of people who engage in bribery and corruption. So it's an ongoing struggle. And frankly, that's why I call myself the Compliance Evangelist, because I see that money lost as a huge problem for the world. And in my part of the world, I've always been I'm a lawyer by professional background. So I've always worked in either a law firm or a corporation. And I see the business model of a corporation as part of the answer to that scourge of bribery and corruption. So I focus on helping companies build out compliance programs and comply with that law so they don't engage in bribery and corruption. And that's what gives me my passion every day.
Wow. I had no idea it was that huge, that impact. And you're right, reclaiming $3 trillion worth of lost investments that could be furthered to build our community and our society is a huge hole to try and get back. Wow. So yeah, I can see why you're a compliance evangelist, because it's hurting us. It's hurting communities, it's hurting businesses, it's hurting individuals. Wow. Okay. So my next question, I have no segue for it. So we'll just have to go for it. And that's like, I introduced the whole conversation today by talking about big picture things. And it's about black swan events. It's one of the things that you wrote to me about that you have some solutions to. And that's how businesses can always be ready for a black swan event. I'm wondering if there's a compliance tie-in here, but if not, that's cool too. So first of all, what is a black swan event and how can businesses be ready for them?
So a black swan event is something that you either couldn't prepare for or had no idea was coming. So I moved to West Texas 2 years ago from Houston, Texas. And in 2017, 2016, we had 2 500-year floods and one 1,000-year flood, meaning that's how often they were supposed to have happened. Well, we had them in 18 months. So we used to think a 500-year flood was a black swan event until we got hit with the big one. And that's a long-winded way of saying there really no such thing as a black swan event. We move in the United States, we move from catastrophic weather events, whether it's floods in Texas, wildfires in California, now wildfires in Canada, which are impacting Washington, D.C., to a presidential election and an insurrection at the U.S. Congress, to whatever the next event was. And probably the most prescient comment I heard coming out of the pandemic was the following. We have moved from disaster recovery to business continuity to business as usual. And so one of the things I try to communicate to people is whether you call it a black swan event or whether you call it the 1,000-year flood or whether you call it the first insurrection in the United States since 1865, you have to be prepared for it. And you have to have processes and procedures in place which will allow your business to continue. If there's a 1,000-year flood and someone calls and you're not open for business, they're going to go to the next person. Frankly, they don't care. And so if you are remote, and as many of us are, where are your servers? Are your servers safe? Can you get to your information? In one of those floods, I was the last person in my corporate legal department that had a working phone. So all international phone calls got routed to me, and then I had to try to figure out how to communicate with the people that needed the information. Are you prepared for that? How are you going to do that? Like I said, where are your servers? Where are your employees? If something goes down, how are you going to respond? Let me go back to that 1,000-year flood again. The entity that was most prepared for that event was the largest grocer in Houston. And they had actually prepared for a situation where they had the 1,000-year flood and couldn't get food stocks into their stores, or their stores were flooded. And they literally set up in the parking lot and just put old-fashioned non-electric cash registers out there and took money. And they were completely prepared for that. That was one of their scenarios. So, of course, people flocked to them. And I shopped at them for the first time. Now I'm a loyal customer because they were ready. So whatever the event is, you have to be able to continue to do business as usual. So you have to build that sort of those policies and procedures into whatever it is your business is.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for sharing that. And I've been doing a little bit of work along similar lines with that. I've got a workshop coming up in a few weeks with a group of farmers in New South Wales. And you talk about bushfires and floods. Well, in Australia, it's a massive cycle that's accelerating, getting more extreme. Drought, fire, flood. And it seems to be a constant cycle through that. And the whole thrust of the workshop is how do we get past reaction and recovery into preparedness and analysis. And I like your comment that there is no really a black swan events because we can forecast some things, a 500-year flood. We forecasted that it may happen. And so we can prepare for that. And that's about building resilience into your business systems, your personal systems, and your community systems. And once the question I get my participants to ask is, well, what could go wrong? And how bad could it get? So it's a little bit of fear setting and then working backwards from there. So if this could go wrong and this is how bad it could get, what can we do now to either prevent that, mitigate it, or if it does happen, deal with it? So I think that's what you're talking about, right? So that sort of preparedness and having these contingencies in place for various scenarios that you can concoct. The black swan is, in terms of its definition, my understanding is that expression came about for people in England only have white swans. They could not imagine a black swan. No such thing exists. And then they arrive in Australia where we've got plenty of black swans and they're like, how the? So an event is like, it's hard to anticipate something you've never seen before, which is different than being able to look at current trends and predict and imagine potential events. So something you've never seen before for, let's say, the Aboriginal people here in Australia is when the first fleet arrived and there are these boats. They've never seen those boats before, that type of thing before, and people in clothes they've never seen before. That is a genuine black swan event. There's no way they could have predicted that within the context of their own experience. So having a look at that, so in the idea of how do we prepare for these things, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, if we're going along the lines, well, we could have probably have predicted that based on what the Russians did in Crimea and profiling Putin and so on. How do you think business has changed since the invasion of Ukraine?
So business has changed after the invasion of Ukraine in 5 ways. A couple of them are really sort of legal and regulatory, but there's some real business changes too. The biggest is supply chain. if you were doing business, if you had raw materials coming out of Russia, if you were buying energy, oil, gas from Russia, obviously you don't have access to it. The same if you're selling into Russia. You had to stop selling into Russia. You couldn't import into it. Right before that happened, there was a very big change in U.S. money laundering laws. And money laundering with Russian oligarchs became much more prominent and nay, even say sexy in the United States, because the most ubiquitous picture of the Russian invasion of Ukraine early in the war was yachts sailing away. And that was Russian oligarchs' yachts trying to get to a port where they wouldn't be seized by U.S. authorities. That ties into money laundering. And this new U.S. law gave bounties to people who turned in money launderers. It's a long-winded way of saying there's a huge cottage industry of people looking for violations of money laundering laws to turn into the U.S. government, including these ships. So we have that. We had a change in U.S. anti-corruption laws, elevating anti-corruption to a national security interest. It was a law before, but things are very different when it becomes a national security interest of the United States. A lot more eyeballs on it, a lot more funding, et cetera. Cybersecurity, we moved from attacks from hackers, either sponsored by or at least tangentially approved by the Russian government, to, as one of my friends said, a full-time non-kinetic war against U.S. companies, meaning there was full-time cyber attacks against the United States, and every business had to be ready for that. And then the last one is ESG. And I know it may not be obvious of the connection between ESG and the Russian invasion, but what it did was strengthen the message of people coming into the workforce, millennials and Gen Zs. They only want to work for a company that has values they believe in. They only want to buy products from companies that has values they believe in. Well, democracy became one of those values in a way it never was, or at least we hadn't thought of democracy as an ESG value. And now companies that continue to do business with Russia, at least in the United States, they were punished by consumers. This was not the government sanctioning them. This was consumers not buying their products. And the biggest one was Pepsi. Pepsi was in the Soviet Union in the 60s before there were very many U.S. companies in. So they had a long-standing relationship with many Russians. Well, that didn't fare well in the U.S. press and with the U.S. consuming public after the invasion. So ESG became even more important, the environmental, the social or sustainable, and the governance part. So really changed business, I think, forever in those 5 ways.
That's really interesting. With the last point around ESG as a rising force, it seems like a counterforce against all the lack of compliance issues that we started the show with, where, corruption, bribery, etc. And the rise of, well, this is how I see it anyway. Technology is enabling businesses to be more transparent, or is demanding that organizations be more transparent. And when you can see what's going on, people's sense of outrage and injustice and unfairness can get activated, therefore being able to demand that companies do better. And I think we see that in the center, as you say, of organizations like Pepsi, who are hand in glove with Russians who are seen as the not good corporate citizens at the moment. So it's kind of an integrated mesh that is hopeful in some ways. So I like how you bring in the regulation aspect of that in terms of how the governments have been responding to these issues, as well as the social pressures that are moving towards that. So in some way, that's a hopeful thing, that this $3 trillion hole that we've got with people skiving off where they shouldn't be, and the rise of both government agency and social pressure to amend that. Do you have a sense of hope around all this stuff?
Absolutely. That's why I call myself the Compliance Evangelist. That's why I'm so passionate about this, because there may still be legal violations. There may still be bribery and corruption, but there's more compliance. And anything I can do, even if it's talking to you on a podcast, I view that as moving the ball forward, because I'm going to get my message out to people who haven't perhaps heard me before. So everything I do, I think, moves that ball forward.
That's good. I think that's all that we can hope for, right? As leaders on the global, who are interested in global issues and even just local issues, is what can we do as individuals to roll the ball forward, as you say, in creating a better world, whether it's in compliance or some other area. You also talked about, we're talking about world stage now. So we've got a potential conflict with China that's bubbling away. Well, there is conflict with China. It's not outright war at the moment. First of all, do you see that there will be outright war happening with China, or an aggravation of the conflict in some way? And what can businesses do now to prepare for that?
So, as to whether there will be a conflict, I was born in 1957. My experience tells me there's never been a world war in my lifetime. I can't imagine a world war, but we had two. So we have to understand that it's a possibility. I hope cooler heads will prevail, but I don't know the answer to that. Post-pandemic, things seem to be much stronger degree worse than they were before the pandemic for a variety of reasons. So what I'm trying to do is communicate to businesses, you need to be ready for this from the business perspective. So supply chain is obviously front of mind. Many Western companies utilize China for raw materials and finished goods. So where are you sourcing your materials? That leads to the Uyghurs and forced labor and modern slavery laws. So there's now a very strong U.S. law against modern slavery focused on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China, where U.S. companies basically cannot buy goods out of Xinjiang, cotton or fabric or finished cloth goods. There are many other countries across the globe who have modern slavery laws as well. So modern slavery laws is second. A third that I have not focused on in the past, but I'm trying to get companies to focus on more now, is what happens if you lose one of your biggest markets that you can sell into. So, for instance, the U.S. timber industry, their number one customer is China. And what happens if China is not available to them as an industry? Are they going to continue to import timber? Or perhaps we have an opportunity to reshore, bring those goods, American manufactured goods. I don't want to say bring them back to America, but just have them not leave America. And I use timber as an example because if that much of the U.S. timber market sells to China, what happens if they sold it inside the United States to build new housing? I don't know the housing situation in Australia, but in the United States, it's getting like it is in England. It's almost impossible for a young couple to buy a starter home now in big cities because they're so expensive, because construction companies make so much more on high-end houses. As the cities expand, land becomes further and further away and less available in city centers. So housing is a huge issue in the United States. And even in the little town I live in, affordable housing is discussed at every business conference. So if we had timber to build houses that would create jobs, that would build houses for younger couples or affordable housing for people who needed housing, perhaps we could kind of reinvigorate an entire industry. And, more jobs means more money, means more taxes, and it's just a upward cycle. Or what if the United States, Australia, England, Western Europe, you name the coalition of countries, said, we're going to sell to each other so that if China is not available, we're not going to force any of those countries to lose economic benefits. And what if we just created a trade zone, not like the old British Empire, but maybe like the Commonwealth, where you have trade that's available to countries of basically democracies, something like that. Or we create regional trade zones with countries that are democracies or our friends. So I think reshoring is a way to, maybe a way to look at there may be actually a business opportunity there. Cybersecurity is equally important with China because they are attacking companies across the globe. And then the last one is a little bit different than Russia is physical security. We have had multiple Western businesses have their offices raided in mainland China. We've had 2 instances where employees were arrested for basically doing things like internal audits, investigative work, due diligence, things that companies have to do in a duty of oversight, whether it's an accountant looking at books and records, whether you look at a subsidiary's books and records, to report the numbers up and give accurate financial statements. So physical security has become more important an issue. Certainly physical security is important in Russia because we had a major U.S. basketball player arrested. We've now had a Wall Street Journal reporter arrested. But for the large part, most Americans are not in Russia doing business. They still are in China doing business. And my sense is the same of Australians are still doing business in China physically. And so the physical security issue, I think, is becoming much more important going forward.
Some of this is so depressing for me. Like, just to think about what countries use, the levers they use to try and get sway over their intentions, whether it's saber rattling or actual warfare is one thing. And then there's subterfuge and cyber warfare, as you mentioned. And then there's trade wars. So here in Australia, we had a few years of trade embargoes from China where they slapped massive tariffs or bans on Australian products. And what you've described as people should consider, it's happened to a lot of agricultural industries here, like barley, which was banned, and rock lobsters and so on. And that was their primary market in each of these sectors, a lucrative one. It just shut the door, and they're like, oh.
What if we went to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, all of the sort of little tigers, and say, we understand you have a huge country to your north, whether it's a friend, whether it's an enemy, whether it's sometimes both, whether it's in between. But we will sell our goods to you and we will import to you. So I think there's a variety of ways to look at this, and maybe there's an opportunity here.
Absolutely, there was an opportunity, and that's what a lot of the industry sectors discovered after their initial year or two or more of pain, where the bottom fell out of their lucrative processes. And I think this comes back to our first principle in a conversation, which is what could go wrong, how bad could it get, and to build up your resilience practices around that. So you don't have all your eggs in one basket is the lesson here with regards to what's your main market. And all the other strategies is like you said, these are the things that could go wrong. Slavery laws could shut down one of your main suppliers, or cybersecurity could hack all your systems. All of a sudden your clients' details are exposed. This stuff could happen. And I think what happens, is organizations get very complacent. And this is probably the enemy of compliance, in that things are going well, it'll just keep going well. And that's not the way the world works. So everything we can do to build up, to get good at looking at what could go wrong and then to do some upstream solutions to that is super important from a leadership point of view and a compliance point of view. So, Tom, are you ready for the Fast Five?
I am.
Okay. What future tech do you most want right now?
It's here, ChatGPT.
Oh, it's so good, right? What do you use it for?
I feel like when I was 12, my parents bought me and my sister an Encyclopedia Britannica. And I thought that was the greatest gift ever because I literally had A to Z at my fingertips, because that's what Encyclopedia Britannica was. And I could look up anything in my house. And that's what I feel like with ChatGPT. I can look up anything. I can summarize anything. Either it doesn't give sort of independent thought, or I'm not sophisticated enough to know how to get that. But if I ask for a summary of a Sherlock Holmes novel, I get it. And if I ask for leadership lessons from Sherlock Holmes, I get that. And so it's given me the ability to create much a broader scope of materials. It is not a final draft of anything. It is a first draft. So if I get a draft of something, I have to edit it. If I ask for a contract, I get a general contract that has to be edited down for the specific laws of the state where I live. But it can provide that first draft, and it makes me much more powerful. And literally, I feel like I did when I got Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's only just the beginning too, which is very cool. So what's the best tip you ever got for leadership?
The best tip I ever got for leadership was one time I had royally pissed off somebody I worked for, and they decided to send me on a punishment assignment for 6 months. And that punishment assignment was I had to go to Dubai for 6 months. And, it turned out it really wasn't that bad of a punishment. But I've sort of pulled my hair out to figure out what to do, whether I should quit or whether I should take the punishment. And because what they wanted me to do was teach contracts. And at that point, I had no idea how to do that. And so I called my father, who is a retired naval officer. And he said, "Are you a lawyer in this company?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, then you're charged with knowing everything a lawyer has to know. It's like in the Navy. Once an officer, always an officer. If they ship you across the world to do something, if you don't know how to do it, you learn to do it before you get there. So I suggest you learn how to teach contracts before you get to Dubai, if you want to save your job." And that was some of the best advice I ever got. Once an officer, always an officer. And just, if you're told to do something, learn it.
Okay, I like it. Good learner mindset principles in that one. All right, so if you can wave your magic wand and let's rephrase this. What's one problem at work you'd love to wave a magic wand and have that problem be fixed right now?
The problem at work is, at least in the United States, this conflict now about return to the office, work from home, or a hybrid work environment. I know productivity numbers during the pandemic actually went up, but with people working from home, with families at home with them doing homeschooling. So it's a very productive style of work and work mode. And I wish companies would quit saying you have to come back to the office for collaboration, because all you do is go to the office and have Zoom calls all day. And if people want the freedom and flexibility to work from home, they should have that freedom and flexibility. And I don't think you need to be sitting at your desk like you're in the third grade.
I like that. That's a great analogy. Third grade. Yes, master, I will be here. So thumbs up or thumbs down? Who's a leader who's doing something right, or who's a leader who's doing something wrong?
Well, I would say Elon Musk has destroyed Twitter, so I don't think too much of that. In terms of a leader who's doing something right, it seems that, at least in the business world, Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan Chase has done a series of right things. And maybe that's because the organization is just so behemoth and it moves, it's like an aircraft carrier. It's not going to turn, at least not too quickly. But he seems to be doing right now. But I don't like what Musk has done to Twitter, and I think he's destroyed the value of a company, of a service that I've used since 2010 from a business perspective that was hugely beneficial to me.
How has it changed for you as a user?
I think it's going to go away because he's destroyed the value. He's destroyed the ability or the desire for companies to advertise, and it will become a right-wing nutbag rabbit hole.
Tell us what you really think. Okay. Thank you for that. And last question in the Fast Five is, what is your favorite leadership book or podcast? And given that you run a ton of podcasts, this is a big question. So favorite leadership book or podcast?
So I'm going to say, actually, it's a movie. What I'd love to do is look at culture, history, Shakespeare, literature, current events for leadership lessons and try to mine those. So I have a podcast called 12 O'Clock High, a podcast on business leadership. I have a podcast called Leadership Lessons from U.S. Presidents. I look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe for leadership lessons. So I like looking at all of those things for leadership lessons. And I love the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and that's one of my favorite movies about leadership lessons. So I created a podcast around that. So I'm going to say that.
Lawrence of Arabia. What leadership lessons did you get from Lawrence of Arabia?
Perseverance, have a vision, and execute on that vision. Be passionate about what you do, and your passion will be communicated to your team. And up until the time he quit doing it, he listened. Eventually he quit listening, and that's when it sort of went sideways. But I think he listened. And probably that's the biggest leadership lesson I've ever heard or I've tried to impart is listen.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. That was Tom Fox and the Fast Five. The Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast is proudly sponsored by the Amplifiers Academy. It is an online self-paced leadership development program that you can join at any time and progress at your pace. There are very short video lessons, great checklists and resources and recommendations and book summaries, all there to help boost your leadership thinking and abilities. We focus on leading strategy, leading culture, leading change, and leading performance. So if you want a go-to resource that can help boost your strategic abilities immediately, check us out, Amplifiers Academy, on the zoerouth.com website. See you there. So, Tom, I'm coming up to the last couple of questions. You mentioned all the fabulous leadership podcasts that you've got there. Where can people find out more about those shows?
Those shows are all a part of the Compliance Podcast Network, available at www.compliancepodcastnetwork.net.
Well, that's very easy. Thank you. Is there any last question I should ask you to help get your message across? Anything else you'd like to say?
I didn't say why. I didn't ever answer your question on why a corporate compliance function should exist separately. It's because, number one, it's so important. It needs, psychologically, a company needs to have a compliance program to emphasize the importance of compliance within the organization. Two, the regulators want to see compliance in one function so that if something goes sideways, they can go to compliance and say, give us the data, whatever that may be. And three, that you have a direct reporting line to the board of directors, where if you're a lawyer in a legal department, you have to go to the general counsel or whatever other corporate function.
Very good. So compliance forms very good governance practice.
Yes.
Fantastic. Tom, thank you so much. Aside from the compliancenetwork.net, is there anywhere else you'd like to send people to find out more about you?
Well, I live in a rural part of West Texas, and I have a podcast network in my little part of West Texas called the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network. And so if you'd like to look at some rural Texas issues, from agriculture to the eclipse coming to my little town, to economic issues, to one of the top 5 museums of Western art in the United States, check out the Texas Hill Country Podcast Network.
Fantastic. Tom, this has been great. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight and for doing the incredible amount of work you are doing in helping businesses and leaders lead better in this crazy times that we're experiencing. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Zoe. It's been a ton of fun.
Well, that conversation was both scary and hopeful at the same time. So I got an overwhelming sense there's a lot of bad stuff happening, and yet there is a counterwave of good stuff happening, whether that's laws that governments are implementing or whether it's the rise in environment, social, and governance practices and the demand from people around that. Anyway, scary stuff and good stuff happening all at the same time. So takeaway and take action for you today that I have come up with is really dig into what could go wrong and how bad could it get. This is about building resilience in your leadership and organization by doing this preemptive strike. And it's part of your responsibility as a leader to look to what's coming on the horizon. So a big picture stuff is really, really important. And the second thing is to make sure that you have a compliance and risk as part of your governance practice in your organization. And how are you looking at these things? And what are the risks internally and externally that you are being aware of, mitigating, eliminating if possible? So my tip of the week comes from my 4th book, People Stuff, Beyond Personality Problems, an Advanced Handbook for Leadership. And to help you with that idea of what could go wrong and how bad could it get, I turn to page 38, where I talk about summary of filters for focus. And this is from the first chapter on perspective. So perspective is power. The more we see, the better we lead is my mantra around this. And there's 3 filters we can look at. One is scenario planning, which is what Tom alluded to in the conversation. And scenario planning is a whole practice from futurist thinking. The basic idea is that map potential futures. It gives us possibilities to choose from in terms of avoiding the futures that we don't want, or if they do occur, being prepared for it. So just like Tom talked about, the grocery store that had anticipated the 500-year flood had stores of food and cash registers that accepted cash. As worst case scenario, we don't have electricity and we can't get supply in. What do we do? How do we serve people? And they had a plan. So that's an example of doing scenarios. And there's a whole methodology around that. Any type of scenario, just do something around that is useful. The second filter is the problem tree. I love the problem tree methodology. Just Google problem tree. You'll get heaps of examples. And I think I spoke about this recently on the show as well. So problem tree is mapping the problem, its effects, and then going to the root causes below. And the third filter that you can use to help do this work is listing assumptions. What do we assume to be true about what's coming next? And these are the stories we tell about a situation, and we can bring some of our biases to light. We just list what we are thinking about something, and we can ask, is this true, or do we just think this is true? And we can dig into that. And we can expose some of the hidden swan blind spots, if you like, when we do that particular work. So that is the tip of the week from People Stuff. Next up on the show, we have Chris Lautenschlager, and we are talking about business for social good. One of my favorite topics. I'm really excited to share this interview with you. And in terms of what's next, I would love to see a picture of where you're listening to on this show, whether it's driving, walking, running, at the gym, whatever. Just give us a little insight as to where you are listening into these leadership insights. It's really cool. Just email me or tag me on social media at zoerouth.com is my website. Zoe Routh handle is across all the social media platforms. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.